quickly to introduce myself and before diving in, welcome. My name is Soomin. I use she, her pronouns, joining here as the Climate Finance Policy Analyst at Climate Action Network Canada, and really feeling incredibly excited and honored to support the work of the network and the Secretariat's Climate Finance at Work and Advocacy moving forward. To also share that I'm joining from Tiohtià:ke, the traditional lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, colonially known as Montreal. And really, because the context of our discussion today is regarding policy and finance, both of which have historically and to this day are used as tools to marginalize, oppress, and perpetuate systemic harms, I really want to first start off by offering my deepest gratitude to the Indigenous land and water defenders from coast to coast to coast and across the world who have really led a lot and many of the international advocacy work that we'll be discussing today. And I hope that this session contributes to the broader conversation of solidarity in this collective fight for justice as folks become more aware of the ways that international climate finance can serve as a tool and a real opportunity for justice and equity as well. And for those who are unaware unfamiliar of Climate Action Network Canada, also known as CAN-Rac. We are a network of over 150 environmental NGOs from coast to coast to coast, with the one main goal of building consensus for the implementation of comprehensive climate change action plans by all levels of government, and for that to be informed by communities, by science, and traditional knowledge of Indigenous rights holders. And CAN-Rac really works in national and international policy domains and convenes the network to mobilize, share knowledge, and build power. And I see that folks are active on the chat and sharing where folks are joining from. Really great to see. Feel free to continue sharing where you're joining from as well. It's great to see the kind of network, the reach that the network has, and for folks to be able to see where the others are joining from as well. Okay, moving on. We mentioned this in the promo post that went up. This is the first of a 4-part webinar series on international climate finance, really in an effort to demystify and unpack the jargon of climate finance as we lead up to November's COP29, the UN Climate Conference that'll be held in Baku, Azerbaijan. And also, so-called Canada will be hosting the G7 Leader Summit in 2025. And domestic discussions are currently ramping up for Canada to establish an updated climate finance target for post-2026. So we hope that this webinar series offers additional context for civil society to mobilize and to hold the government accountable to its fair share in working towards a more equitable, just, and climate resilient future for all. As you can see on the slide, the second session will be held in August, and that will be on Canada's fair share of climate finance. The third session will be held in September about the ins and outs of the new climate finance target that will be negotiated and currently is in discussion, and that's called the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance. You might also see it referred to as NCQG, which is the acronym. The fourth session, the first and last one, will be held in October, and that will be discussing Canada's commitments and progress in climate finance as it prepares for COP29. And we'll have fantastic speakers and experts joining us for the 3 other webinars. It is just me today, but for the other ones, I'm really excited about the conversations that we'll be able to have collectively and for folks to be able to ask lots of questions to those experts as well. So for more information on the specific dates and the sessions, please keep an eye out on our social media and our newsletter as information will be shared through those channels. Okay, so you've all signed up for a quick webinar on the intro to climate finance. And I really want to take a moment to really situate this conversation by first unpacking what climate finance is. Often this word climate finance, I find that holds a lot of baggage, and a clear definition is not always set. Just as an anecdote, I was having a conversation with a friend recently, and we were talking about climate finance, but it felt like something was not quite fitting right. And we figured out we were talking about 2 completely separate things. My friend was discussing ESGs, the environmental, social, and good governance finance aspect, and I was talking more about the international climate negotiations. And we realized that, yes, we might call climate finance climate finance, sustainable finance, whatever terms we might be using, but they actually, it's really important to define things in the beginning. So hoping that by having this slide up and by introducing the various definitions that are shared, folks have a broader understanding of what's generally being discussed when we talk about international climate finance. So first, a definition offered by the UN Climate Change Standing Committee on Finance. They say that reducing emissions and enhancing sinks of greenhouse gases and aims at reducing vulnerability of and maintaining and increasing the resilience of human and ecological systems to navigate climate change impacts is what climate finance is. The Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment says finance for activities aiming to mitigate or adapt to the impacts of climate change is what climate finance is. And lastly, another example by the World Resource Institute that the flow of funds towards activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or help society adapt to climate change impacts, and really the totality of flows directed to climate change projects is what climate finance is. So you can kind of see that there are similar threads here and there, but they all kind of sound a little bit different. But ultimately, I think that while there's multiple definitions of what climate finance is, it generally means the mobilization of public and private money into three large buckets, and that's mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And climate finance is really critical to action the nationally determined contributions, which are the climate plans that countries put forward to really ensure that they're working towards addressing climate change and actively mitigating and adapting as well. And also to address unique needs such through the National Adaptation Plans, which are known as NAPs. And as you might be able to guess, climate finance is really foundational to the Paris Agreement. And I hope that at the end of the session, what you take away is that climate finance is really about ambition, it's about taking accountability, and ultimately that it's about justice as well. And to understand kind of the context of the conversations that are taking place today, I think it's really important to think about and reflect on what the progress has been so far. And to share a quick, brief history of climate finance, in 2009, that was when COP15 was held in Copenhagen, developed countries came together to commit to a collective goal of mobilizing $100 billion USD every year by 2020. Unfortunately, this goal had no details on the type of funding or what would count towards that $100 billion goal, yet countries committed to mobilizing finances to address the climate crisis. Fast forward a few years, in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed at COP21, and in this agreement, it included Article 9, which speaks to the need to provide financial resources to assist developing countries with mitigation and adaptation. And they also decided that a new goal to replace the $100 billion commitment would come before 2025. And now, a decade after the $100 billion target that was set in 2009 at COP15, in 2020, developed countries actually failed to meet this goal by the initial timeline. And the OECD announced recently that a total of 115.9 billion USD had actually been mobilized in 2022, meeting the $100 billion goal for the first time in 2022. However, challenges remain regarding the quality and the amount of climate finance that was actually mobilized. And as we get through the webinar, I'll share a little bit more about the challenges that climate finance faces. And that really contributes to yes, that money was mobilized, but let's get down to the detail. Was it actually, and how was it allocated and used to implement climate action goals? And now that leaves us to 2024. Building from the $100 billion target per year, the new collective quantified goal in climate finance, the NCQG, that will be, it's to be negotiated before 2025, making climate finance one of the centerpiece of this November's COP29 that'll be held. So super fast overview, but gives you an idea of how this conversation really emerged at an international multilateral level, and how this conversation continues to evolve, and to really point to the fact that yes, this ambitious goal was established, but ultimately developed countries had failed to meet that target. How do we then ensure that this new target actually reflects the needs of countries that are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, and that we can ensure that climate finance is at the heart of climate justice efforts, and that will be negotiated at COP29. Okay, but all of this, what does the text say? What does the Paris Agreement say? Without getting too nitty-gritty into the details, just want to share a quick overview of what's included in there. Climate finance is explicitly mentioned in the Paris Agreement. As you can see on the left column there, Article 9 speaks to climate finance the most. And 9.1 at the top there, you can see that it says developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to both mitigation and adaptation in continuation of their existing obligation under the convention. I want to highlight the fact that it says developed countries over there, and also the both mitigation and adaptation. You might see that while the Paris Agreement is written as is right now, as you can see on the screen, there are different interpretations of it. And based on those interpretations, different countries take different positions and advocate for their interpretation to be the standard as things are being negotiated. So you might see in the upcoming year or so, as these negotiations continue to unfold, that these articles are specifically brought in to justify that specific perspective that folks might have. So I want to really lay that out there, and for folks to recognize that this is what it says in the text. And again, that there might be, that this is an ongoing discussion about its interpretations. 9.2 says other parties are encouraged to provide or continue to provide such support voluntarily. 9.3 says developed country parties should continue to take the lead in mobilizing climate finance from a wide variety of resources, instruments, and channels, noting the significant role of public funds through a variety of actions, including supporting country-driven strategies and taking into account the needs and priorities of developing country parties. So again, really highlighting the fact that it says developed countries should take the lead in mobilizing climate finance, and also the specific note on public funds as well as highlighted. And on the right-hand column, that really speaks to the ambition level of climate finance and needing to align climate financing with the ambition of the 1.5 degree target that the Paris Agreement is held in. 2.1c is the specific one that does that. And it says that climate finance flows should be consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And it also says that this should be implemented to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. So folks might have heard of the acronym CBDR. This is specifically what it's speaking to, this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities really is at the heart of the climate agreement and heart of the Paris Agreement. And it speaks to how countries that have emitted the most, the countries that are well developed, must really pave the way in mitigating and also financing to support other countries to mitigate and to adapt to the harms caused by the climate crisis that they had contributed the least to. To wrap all this up in what it says in the text, ultimately, it's really about ensuring finance flows align with the objectives of the 1.5 degree target, if we're going to ever reach it. And it means scaling up good quality finance and scaling down financing of fossil fuel industry as well. And this will be further interpreted in the upcoming negotiations. And there might be different pieces brought into it as well about which entities are included. Is it just the government? Is it private? Is it financial institutions? It could also mean changing of domestic financial institutions and systems to align with the 1.5 degree target based on how it's interpreted. So that's where a lot of the contentions lie, in the fact that, yes, this is what the text says, but how are we interpreting it? And how do we agree as an international community that our interpretations that we're deciding on will lead us to that 1.5 degree pathway? I know all of this sounds very technical, but really at the heart of it, and to boil all of this down, I think it's really about framing climate finance as a justice issue. Ultimately, climate finance is about realizing climate justice, and without the allocation and the the distribution of finances to countries that are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, like small island developing states, like the least developed countries, commitments become lip service and lack the ambition that is deeply needed from developed countries. And we've seen from various speeches at various big conferences at COPs, the commitment by developed countries to reiterate support for climate justice and for ambition. But in order to actually implement that and to live up to those commitments, developed countries really need to step up. And providing climate finances is providing the lever to develop ambitious climate mitigation and adaptation plans. And it ensures that plans are actually translated into action. Okay, let's dive into the global landscape of climate finance. What's actually the number? What's actually being financed? I want to maybe start this out with a caveat that you might see various number figures as well. There are some numbers that folks agree on, but even then, as I'll share later on, there's a wide range of numbers that are provided, and that's not to discredit the work that that folks within climate financing world do to try to track this the flows of climate finance as much as possible. But it's really the difficulty in tracking these and how that adds another layer of complexity in this broader conversation about climate finance. So if you're confused about different numbers that you're seeing online in various news medias and what I'm sharing here, the discrepancies really highlights the fact that that the difficulty of tracking those numbers down. But generally, these are numbers pulled from the Climate Policy Institute that puts out a global landscape of climate policy report every year. And they shared that in their most recent report, annual climate finance needed through 2030 is at $9 trillion. And this figure will jump to over $10 trillion from 2031 to 2050. And climate finance must increase by at least fivefold annually to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That's a big number. But in recent speech, Simon Steele, the executive secretary of UN Climate Change, said a quantum leap this year in climate finance is both essential and entirely achievable. Again, these numbers are ginormous numbers, 9 trillion, 10 trillion, and more big numbers will come. But how do we finance this amidst a poly crisis? Can this kind of finance be mobilized? And to that question, the answer I would present is on the right side of the screen here, where you'll see a graph showing a comparison of how much money is used for climate finance at the top there in the green, compared to other uses in the gray there. Again, at the top, you see how much climate finance is actually mobilized. And at the bottom is how much is actually needed until 2030 annually. In the middle, you can see that at the top of the gray bar, $2.2 trillion was used globally for military, $7 trillion were used annually for fossil fuel subsidies, and 11.7 trillion was used and mobilized for COVID emergency fiscal measures. And these numbers are annual numbers as well. And I think this really points to the fact that it's really time for climate change to receive the same kind of financial mobilization and action that other crises like COVID receive. Okay, let's go one step further down. There's that big $1 trillion number there, the 9 trillion that is needed annually from climate financing. What's kind of within that? What are the layers to it? I mentioned at the top of the webinar here that there are three main buckets that climate finance falls into, and that's mitigation finance, adaptation finance, and loss and damage. Let's talk first a little bit about mitigation finance. Mitigation finance invests in addressing the core problem of the climate crisis and finances decarbonization effects like energy efficiency programs and sustainable transport. But not all sectors are funded equally. Energy and transport sectors experience the largest investment gaps. And while the agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, also known as a FOLU sector, has the largest mitigation potential, it remains underfunded and needs to grow by 150 times compared to 2021-2022 levels. So that's a huge gap that that climate finance is lacking and needs to overcome to ensure that that money is actually being put into areas that need it the most, and that we can actually finance mitigation projects that help us meet that 1.5-degree target. Moving on to adaptation finance. Adaptation finance builds resilience and strengthens communities. And currently, current levels of adaptation finance is around at $21 billion USD, according to the latest UN Environmental Program report. And they also release an annual report called the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. And their 2023 report found that the cost of implementing adaptation priorities in developing countries are estimated at $215 to $387 billion per year this decade, which means compared to the 21 billion that is spent annually on adaptation initiatives, there remains a gap of 194 to $366 billion per year. And this amount is 10 to 18 times greater than the current international public adaptation finance flows that are available. And adaptation finance is really critical as it can reduce climate risks and deliver high benefits. So investing in adaptation against things like coastal flooding and strengthening infrastructure, ensuring that agricultural systems are strong and resilient. This can limit and decrease the harms caused by the climate crisis. And without taking action on adaptation, it'll only make the loss and damage finance that we'll be discussing very shortly a lot bigger. So taking action, adaptation, while it sounds like often sounds like an afterthought to mitigation, both of them need to be worked on simultaneously, and both of them need to be financed simultaneously so that we limit as much harm and damage caused by the climate crisis as much as possible, and at a smaller cost than what it could amount to later on. To compare the mitigation finance and the adaptation finance just a little bit, in an already underfunded landscape of international climate finance, the funding gap between mitigation finance and adaptation finance remains wide. So if you look at the total of domestic and international private and public climate finance flows, mitigation finance makes up 91%, whereas adaptation finance makes up 5%. And the remaining 3 to 4 percentage points there go to projects that combine both mitigation and adaptation projects. But you can kind of see from this graph here the underfunding of adaptation finance and the critical need for adaptation finance to be increased significantly to ensure that it gets to the point where mitigation and adaptation finance projects are being funded at the level of finances that they need and will make a huge impact. And the reasoning behind this is whereas mitigation projects have higher potential for financial return on investments through renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc., this really attracts higher rates of investment, and private actors also invest quite a bit in mitigation projects as well. However, due to the nature of adaptation projects, such as coastal protection, agriculture, etc., that produce benefits that often cannot be measured directly in financial terms, but are really crucial to community livelihoods and for community survival, very limited amount is allocated to adaptation finance. Again, highlighting that both buckets are equally important and that adaptation finance really needs to increase significantly to ensure that it can be met at the levels of financing that it needs. And lastly, the third bucket of climate finance, loss and damage. Loss and damage, folks might not be familiar with the term. It's really broadly talking about the negative harm to communities and people as a result of the climate crisis. So examples include desertification, species extinction, crop failures, and this impact and devastating impacts and harms will continue to become, if not more severe, the longer the inaction and the longer that mitigation and adaptation initiatives are underfunded. It's estimated that approximately 447 to $894 billion USD per year by 2030 could be needed to meet developing countries' needs. And the amount of financing, again, needed for loss and damage will depend heavily on the level of ambition in mitigation and adaptation action and financing. At the bottom there, at a recent COP27 in 2022, I believe, yes, 2022, the Loss and Damage Fund was established, and this was recently renamed as the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and it will be set in the Philippines. And this is really all thanks to the tireless advocacy and work of small island states and developing countries. Okay, so going a little bit further into the 5 Ws of climate finance. What does it look like? Who does it come from? Where does it go? When is it needed? By how much? And why is it needed? I think it's really important to understand these 5 Ws, as it'll inform why climate finance is important, why this is at the centerpiece of the negotiations that are coming up, and why this is something that we as a collective need to be paying more attention to as well. And not just for the negotiations that are coming up, but continuing on past that. To start with, what does climate finance look like? Before we answer that question, I think it's important to answer what counts as climate finance. And I mentioned this again at the top of the webinar, that there's lots of different opinions on the definition of climate finance. And there's also no internationally agreed standard. Therefore, due to this inconsistency in standardizing what climate finance is, some countries count investment into improving efficiency of coal plants as climate finance, and lots of false solutions may then also count as climate finance. And of course, greenwashing and double counting plays a huge role in this as well, and therefore it is particularly challenging to track finances thoroughly. And you can see on the right-hand graph there, the diagram, you can see that the colors in dark green are finances that are tracked, whereas the lighter shades are things that are tracked to a lesser degree, and there's differing opinions, and it's difficult to really confirm those numbers. And you'll see that there are 2 white blocks there that are just simply not tracked as well. So this, I think, paints a really great picture of the state of complexity that climate finance experiences. And this is also influenced by various multilateral and bilateral agreements and commitments as well. So all of this plays a role in, I don't need to continue highlighting this, but the complexity of climate financing that the world experiences today. And second, to further define what climate finance looks like, what is the quality of climate finance is something that is critical. I mentioned earlier at the $100 billion agreement that was agreed at COP15 in 2009, there were no specific agreements on what kind of money that would be. And unfortunately, there's 3 large buckets that have emerged from that. And the first is grants and contributions, second, concessional, third, blended finance. I won't go too much into detail, but to quickly recap what they are, grants and contributions are international climate financing that does not have to be repaid. And it ensures that developing countries that are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis do not become chronically indebted. And we'll chat a little bit more about these dangers when we discuss the blended finance later on. Second category is concessional. These are below market rate finances that are often provided by multilateral funds, by development banks, and other financial institutions. They offer lower interest rates and more flexible terms and longer repayments, so it can kick off initiatives that would otherwise not be implemented without financial support. It offers more flexibility and ensures that folks are able to access financing without taking on too much interest rates on top of their existing loans that they have to pay back. And the third category is blended finance. And this is the combination of financing of public concessional, private, and public resources. Blended finance, although championed by many, has been criticized for its perpetuation of inequity, of increased loans, and chronic indebtedness for many developing countries. And they can come from private sector financing and multilateral development banks as well. So out of all this information, if you take away one thing, it's that climate financing isn't meant to be a business opportunity, nor should it continue to make money for those providing the financing at the expense of those receiving that financing. If climate finance is provided at high interest rates, countries at the front lines of the climate crisis have no choice but to put themselves in further debt to pay back interest rates. And this puts them into a cycle of debt and thus becoming chronically indebted. In May 2024, an expose by Reuters found that wealthy countries actually reaped billions in economic rewards from climate finance. That contradicts the notion of reparations and compensation for the harms and damage of climate change. Wealthy countries loaned at least $18 billion at market rate interest with many strings attached, such as requiring purchasing from the lender's country's companies, requiring the main contractor to be from the lender's country, outsourcing construction and material building from a specific country that is outside of the country receiving the loan. And this puts that priority over hiring local companies, contractors, and workers. And therefore, it's no surprise that 3 out of the top 4 climate finance contributors favored loans over grants. But it really, I think, presents the question, this report by Reuters, is it really climate financing if it puts countries into further debt and if it puts them into further cycles of harm and violence? And it really questions, I think, the point of common but differentiated responsibilities. I think it puts into question the notion of justice and equity. If we think about climate financing as the means to implement climate justice, is this, with all these strings attached, with all these loans and interest rates, actually contributing to that discussion and contributing to that action? And this will be further discussed as the new climate finance target is being negotiated. But we also really want to ensure that how we frame it is that countries should be able to, that developed countries should be paying for their fair share and for their reparations and compensate countries that are experiencing the harms and the violence that they, again, contributed the least to. And this continues, I think, to this question of who pays for climate finance. Again, speaking to the core principle of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances, CBDR-RC. As seen and explicitly named in the Paris Agreement article, as we've seen in a little bit higher up in the presentation, developed countries have a responsibility to lead financing. Furthermore, it must contribute its fair share of climate finance. While that fair share bit isn't included in the Paris Agreement, it's a really important notion that civil society continues to bring up because of points within a little bit higher up. Like, again, we saw from the Article 2.1c that really ensures that finance flows need to align with the 1.5 degree target. We know who's emitting the most. We know who needs financing the most. Therefore, those should be aligned. And one of the most challenging and contentious questions of climate finance is who provides that climate financing. Currently, UN Climate Change does not specify which country should provide financing, but the broad terms of developed countries has been used. Yet this term has not been defined either. Therefore, countries have resorted to using the 1992 created Annex 2 countries, which includes members of the OECD and the European Commission. And that list has essentially been used to define the contributor base that is contributing climate finances. However, global economic landscape has shifted quite a bit and experienced dramatic differences since 1992. And some countries have grown in economy and in emissions as well. So negotiations on this conversation has been quite challenging, influenced by geopolitical tensions, and calls to expand the climate finance contributor base has been met with a wide range of perspectives. Proposals to expand the contributor base according to income and emission levels could significantly increase the climate finance envelope, as it would encourage countries to pay its fair share. And it's argued that this would spread the burden of climate finance more broadly, and that developed countries, including Canada, would provide climate financing closer to its actual fair share based on its gross national income and cumulative emissions, and add significant amount of money. All this money, where does it go? All regions actually receive international climate finance, but particularly the global south countries and communities disproportionately impacted by climate change. One of the examples more recently is that the Caribbean is one of the regions most at risk of the climate crisis. And you might have seen on the news about Hurricane Beryl. It's estimated that cleanup alone will cost tens of billions of dollars before factoring in rebuilding destroyed communities and livelihoods. This hurricane swept through Grenada and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and again, estimated large numbers, close to 510 million USD to rebuild economies, homes, and communities. And it's these countries and regions that are facing high financial burdens to a problem that they have contributed the least to. And this highlights, again, the need for the international community, especially developed countries that have benefited from causing the climate crisis, to pay its climate debt to these countries as well. When is climate finance needed, and by how much? I mentioned the quote from Simon Steele, the head of UN Climate Change. He also called for a quantum leap and a new target for climate finance that meets developing countries' needs. And on top of that, in early 2025, countries will resubmit their nationally determined contributions, their countries' unique national plans that they have for climate action, and which will need additional finances to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate crisis. And if the financing isn't there, then these submitted plans will not be ambitious, nor will it ultimately be implemented. So the time is now that climate finance needs to significantly ramp up, especially heading into the new negotiations on the NCQG. And why is climate finance needed? I think I've mentioned this a couple of times at this point, but climate finance is really about climate justice, I think. And without developed countries financing and paying its climate debt, statements of ambition and cooperation ultimately become empty promises. And to put a number on this, investing now would save trillions of dollars compared to business as usual. Increasing climate investments to the levels needed by 2050 will lead to a reduction in economic losses by 2100 of $1,266 trillion lower than the business as usual scenario. So this is a significant economic loss that could be avoided if we start increasing climate finances and investments to the level that is actually needed. The NCQG, the new climate finance target, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. More will come on this topic in the in future webinars, but ultimately I wanted to introduce it a little bit and kind of the key points that we're hoping for. First is the quantity that it's above $100 billion, that's the absolute baseline, and that it actually goes closer to the number needed by the global community to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Second, that it's ambitious, equitable, and serve the global South's needs. That is a really important aspect that ensures that no strings are being attached to climate financing, like exposed by the Reuters report, that countries are actually providing this money as a means of reparation and addressing climate change, not as a business opportunity. And lastly, that it's additional to the official development assistance, that climate financing should not impact other pre-existing development funds and initiatives, and that it is a separate additional thing. A little bit about Canada's climate finance pledges. This is what Canada is currently committed to so far. From 2021 to 2026, Canada has pledged for $5.3 billion. And within this pledge, so far as of January 2024, 3.2 million, so 60% of the pledge, is estimated to have been allocated to date. And Canada's fair share, and all these numbers are calculated by Brian Tomlinson, as you can see there. I highly recommend you check out some of the research that he has done. Canada's fair share of the $100 billion USD is estimated to be about $9 billion Canadian. And this is based on the relative size of the Canadian economy. And so therefore, Canada's 5.3 billion is really only 59% of its fair share. And of that $5.3 billion pledge, it's been broken down into three main buckets as well. 65% has gone to mitigation, 34% to date has been to adaptation, and 1% to loss and damage. And 47% of its climate finance pledge has been made in loans, and 53% has been made in grants. And to unpack this a little bit more, we'll have the next webinar will actually be on Canada's fair share. So you can learn a little bit more about what Canada owes to the global community in terms of its climate finance contributions. And again, huge thanks to Brian for all his research in calculating these numbers. So in order to address all of this, in order to really ramp up ambition, to sound the bell, sound the drum, sound the alarm on the need for ambitious climate finance target, leading up to the negotiations at COP29, leading up to all these conversations about ramping up ambition to meet the 1.5 degree target. CAN International Climate Action Network International has started its Pay Up campaign today, actually. So right now, I would love to invite all of you folks to maybe take a moment or two, go on your social media. It's probably right now most active on Twitter or X. Search up hashtag Pay Up, hashtag Climate Finance Now, and Trillions Not Billions. And take a read at some of the campaign material that's been shared, that's been circulated by folks, and feel free to contribute to it as well. If there's anything that you learned from this webinar, if folks wanted to contribute to this campaign right now by sharing some of that, maybe doing some of your own research on top of it if you feel called to it, and including the use of those hashtags that are listed at the top there, that would be really fabulous. It's really about ensuring that folks are more aware of the climate debt that developed countries owe to the global south. It's about ensuring that now is the time to raise ambition. Now is the time to really put money where our mouth is and ensure that we are financing the amount that is needed in order to develop and implement ambitious climate mitigation and adaptation plans that we have. So highly recommend that you folks take a moment to engage with this campaign. And to wrap it all up, tying all of this together, climate financing is needed to rebuild trust. So developed countries fail to deliver the annual $100 billion per year target by 2020, and trust has therefore been broken between the global north and the south. So being ambitious now to rebuild that trust is crucial, and climate finance is at the heart of rebuilding the trust. There's been a severe underfunding of climate finance, and this is a choice. As we've seen from the graphic that I shared about the global flow of climate financing, in 2022 alone, G7 countries spent over $1 trillion funding war, $2.2 trillion in global military expenditure, and a total of $316 billion of public funds to subsidize fossil fuels. So the lack of climate financing is not because there's a lack of finances, it's because there's a lack of political will, and it's a deliberate choice that is being made to underfund climate initiatives. So that ultimately needs to shift, and the time to shift that is right now. Climate finance is the catalyst behind climate action and justice. Therefore, ambitious and equity-centered climate financing that meets the needs of communities disproportionately impacted by climate change, that really uphold gender equity, human rights, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and intergenerational justice as well. without climate financing and without ensuring that climate initiatives are funded, all these other adjacent rights and these equity and justice initiatives that are being put forward will ultimately not be as successful as they can be. Climate impacts truly all sectors and all peoples and all communities, but it definitely disproportionately impacts some communities and sectors more. So really climate financing is, I feel is at the heart of many of our collective fight for justice and our collective fight for solidarity and liberation and equity, and really it really is the catalyst behind that action and justice piece. Okay, I know that was quite a bit of material to walk through, but I'm going to end this presentation bit here at this point and open the floor up for some quick questions. So if folks have a few questions that they wanted to ask, I can check the chat to see if anything has been shared so far. Patricia, did you notice any questions that were shared?
Yeah, there are like bunch of like comments, but if you can hover to the Q&A, I think there are some interesting questions in the Q&A section. Okay. I'm happy to lift from the chat.
Beautiful. Well, thanks folks for your questions here. Okay, what can the coalition of environmental groups do? Oh, this is from Letitia. What can a coalition of environmental groups do to campaign for the Canadian government to be prepared for and do what is needed at COP29? Fabulous question. I think this is also, yes, a mobilization needed for COP29, but also for Canada to host the G7 presidency next year. I think it's really about engaging with some of the campaign that is happening right now. So the Pay Up campaign that we shared earlier, some more numbers and resources will be shared. So please keep an eye out for what CAN-Rac is sharing, what CAN International is sharing. And I think it's really about helping folks understand the frame of climate finance as a frame of justice. Often, I think when I first came into learn more about climate financing, that finance piece really, I felt a little bit daunting. It felt a little daunting, it felt a little scary at times, but framing it through the lens of justice and equity, I think it really puts things into perspective and understanding that this is a critical piece, the puzzle piece that is missing to ensure that there is, I suppose, fuel put behind some of the ambitious plans and actions that are being put forward. So thanks for that question. Oh, I noticed somebody put their hand up, but feel free to jot them down into the Q&A. If I don't get to your question today, again, this is first of a 4-part webinar series. So we'll be sure to take the questions that you put here and introduce them and incorporate them into our planning for the remainder of the webinar series. So please be rest assured that that they will be answered at some point throughout the webinar series, but feel free to jot them down. Okay, I'm just gonna check a few more questions. Is there anything in the agreement about reducing climate emissions from wars and fighting? Countries are committing money to help the climate, but if there are other actions counteract that, aren't they just paying restitution? Great question. There is definitely conversations emerging around that. Nothing is explicitly said in the Paris Agreement nor in the negotiations about that specific thing that you're bringing forward. But absolutely, I think it really goes to the conversation about mitigation. And we've seen from recent COPs that we're having a much more nuanced conversation about fossil fuel industry, about what's actually contributing to the high levels of emission. So those conversations are absolutely happening in the fringes and being brought forward actively by civil society. So if that is a specific area that speaks to you, there's lots of organizations leading that work as well. So thanks for that question. We'll take one last question and then we'll probably have to wrap up fairly soon. Would forgiving international debt be one way of meeting the climate finance goals? Great, another question, Letitia. Absolutely, this is a conversation that is happening and emerging and growing every day. There's lots of conversations about tax justice. So feel free to take a look at some of those. And canceling climate debt, canceling debt is something that is brought forward to lots of protests happening at COPs as well. So negotiators are faced with these proposals that are being put forward. And I believe there was a recent campaign happening at the international level around climate debt cancellation. So I unfortunately can't give you the exact name right now, but absolutely efforts are happening around there, and highly recommend that you check them out. Okay. Beautiful. Sorry, I see a question from Carol. Maybe I'll wrap this up with this. Hearing the tricky topic of contributor-based expansion brought up, which is very politically charged this year. Carol was looking at the statement from BASIC, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China today, and seeing the pushback on that question as amounts to dilution of legal obligation and serves to divert negotiations. Curious to share more on the Global South perspective on this. Great question. Maybe I'll preface this answer with saying that there's already quite a bit of South to South finance flows that are happening that are often not highlighted at the international level. And some of those countries have definitely contributed quite a bit, and some are making their commitments on their own as well. In terms of some of the pushback around diverting negotiations, this is, I think, one of the biggest contention happening within the broader conversation of climate finance. And a lot of folks fear that this question will divert negotiations and lead to it being a bit of a stalemate around it as well. And the Global South, I believe, is for sure coming together and saying, we've seen from recent reports that G77 has been quite unified in their call for increased climate financing and the need for the Global North to really take the lead in leading those conversations. But for sure, we'll continue to see that and hope that with more nuanced conversation around climate financing, that we're able to ensure that ambition levels are raised and equity is really at the heart of all climate finance conversations. Okay, I see that we're almost at time now, so I will wrap up Q&A here. But again, if additional questions remain, please feel free to jot them down, folks. We'll be sure to address them as well. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. It was really great to have a lot of folks engaging in the chat. I see that there's lots of conversations happening here, a lot of folks introducing themselves, which was really fabulous to see. And thanks again for making the time to join us today. As you can see on the screen, we have the schedule for the future sessions listed out here. The second session held in August on Canada's fair share of climate finance. Third, held in September for the new collective quantified goal in climate finance, the NCQG. The fourth session in October on Canada's commitments and progress in climate finance as it prepares for COP29. So we're really excited about these future webinars and the conversations that we'll be having. And we'll absolutely dive a little bit deeper into some of the concepts that were introduced today as well. But thanks everyone. I hope you have a great rest of the day and hope to see you out on the #PayUp campaign. Thanks everyone.